Greetings, Unhidden Voices family, and welcome to this episode. A few years ago, I started a tradition for Black History Month where I send a list of books by and about Black people to the children and young adults in my life, and I tell them, pick any book you want. The only thing you have to do is agree to read it before next Black History Month, and I purchase the book and I send it to them. And so this is why this episode is such an inspiration and it's such a joy because I speak to JaNay Brown-Wood, who's a children's book author, and she talks to us about what it means to write books about children who look like her. Such an inspiration, so important. And I hope that you are inspired by this to join the tradition and buy a book by and about Black people and celebrate Black History Month. So continue to listen, learn, and amplify with us.
Okay, so please talk to us and tell us about your work as an author. I know that you just published a new book, but let's give us a little bit of background and tell us, like, when did you first start writing?
So my new book is coming out in June, but I have always loved writing all the way back to when I was in elementary school. And what's really interesting is that although I loved writing, I hated reading. I hated it. I have an older sister who she could sit down and just inhale books like, it was dinner. And me, it was pulling teeth to get me to read. Although I liked being read too, I didn't like reading. But I loved writing. And so I used to write myself into my own stories. So I have always loved writing all the way back to when I was in elementary school. I remember loving writing poetry, stories, but I hated reading. Reading was like pulling teeth, and that was so much different than my older sister who could just sit there and inhale books. But me, I just did not enjoy reading. I liked being read too, but I didn't like reading myself. And often, it just seems like such a disconnection because, like, how do you love writing but hate reading? And so sometimes I wonder if it's because I didn't see myself in the books that were available to me. So instead, I wrote myself into books, or I wrote people who I knew into books. I remember being in elementary school and writing Detective JaNay Brown. And I was like this detective, and I would solve all these mysteries. And I would just get lost in writing those stories. And even in elementary, I wrote these picture books. They were called Taylor the Tyrannosaurus Rex, because my little sister's name was Taylor. And so I was all about writing, but just did not vibe with reading. And so I think the work that I do now, that's always in the back of my mind. Perhaps why I didn't like to read is because, again, I couldn't find myself on the pages. And so as an author, I try to rectify that. I try to make sure that little kids who look like me or who had experiences similar to mine can find themselves on the pages of books. Because I know literacy is so important. The ability to read, to write, to spell is so important in our society to allow for success, to move through, our academic journeys, moving into employment. And so if kids are struggling to build strong reading skills, that's a problem. And in education right now, when we look at things like the NAEP, right, the Nation's Report Card pertaining to reading scores, it's clear that there's a problem somewhere with relation to children learning how to read and read well. So I think that sums up a little bit of why I do what I do, which is I am an author. I write poetry and picture books for children, and especially for that center on children of color. The protagonists, the main characters in my stories tend to be children of color. So I write because of that. And also research that I do is looking at, well, what happens when kids don't see themselves in books, or how does diversity influence how children look at books? So I think all of this stems from wanting to learn more about how to get literacy in children's lives in an authentic way, and how that leads to improvements in literacy rates, interest in reading books, etc. So that's like a super long answer.
No, it's good. It gives
to your question.
Absolutely. So yesterday I do want to hear your thoughts on not just the inauguration, but also the Amanda Gorman and her, oh my God. And I know you said that, you know, you are also a poet, and Amanda, I saw a follow-up interview that she did in CNN, and she was talking about just the inspirations that she had. So this is a two-part question. The first part is, can you talk about just, you know, what you were doing and what your response was and how you felt like listening to Amanda's poetry and just, you know, the experience of yesterday with, you know, Kamala Harris becoming the first Black and South Asian vice president. And then the second part is about your inspiration. So we know that Amanda was talking about like that she finds text and she would search for text, and that words basically inspire her. So she looks at words and she sees them in new ways, and that kind of that puzzle piece kind of idea helps her to kind of envision what a poem might become. And so what inspires you? So two-part question.
Okay, so I'll start off with what was I doing? Let me tell you what I was doing, Amina. My mother, who also lives in Sacramento, invited me and my daughter. Her name is Vivian, and so she's 3. She'll be 4 next week. Dang, how did that happen? Anyway, she's 3-ish, 4-ish, and so my mom invited me, her, my mother-in-law, and my sister-in-law all over to her apartment so we can have us an inauguration party. So we were all in my mom's living room watching as this queen came up to that podium with so much confidence, with so much eloquence, just speaking this truth, this inspiration, this joy, sitting up there in her yellow coat. I mean, sparkling. Oh, it was just this moment.
Yeah.
I mean, she had her hair twisted up, and then with that beautiful head. Oh, Amina. I just.
And the gold beads. Oh, the regal. That was just
everything.
regal, wasn't it not? It was just regal. Oh,
queen. And I just felt her words in my soul. And I felt so excited that my daughter was watching her up there speaking this beautiful poetry. And it was just this moment. It was this moment that still resonates with me, to the point where this morning when I was doing my fitness walk, I pulled that video up again and I listened to her words again. Yes, and I just, so I guess what that whole moment did for me was just, I felt seen through her. You know, I felt touched, I felt moved, I felt inspired more. And I felt like, yeah, we got this.
Yeah.
Moving forward.
Yes.
Amanda, where are we going, girl? Let's do this, you know?
Yes.
So I just, that moment just wrapped around my whole heart. And then watching Kamala be sworn in and having her name be mispronounced again.
What
and
is
her
up with this? What, like,
and her not even missing a beat, though. Yeah. She recollected I Kamala, thank you. It just, so I guess that juxtaposed with Amanda, watching another queen, Michelle Obama, come in as she did.
Yes.
It was just this juxtaposition of like, this is where we still are, mispronouncing it, that's okay, but look at where we're going. We are doing it with our heads held high. We are moving our children forward. We are moving this country forward.
Yes.
So that inauguration just, It was uplifting, their music choices, the messages that they were spreading. It was a beautiful moment, a much needed moment. It felt like a moment of recovery,
Yeah.
a moment of, I'll also say, on the way home from the inauguration, I have Vivian, my 4-year-old, 3-ish, 4-year-old in the back seat, and I just could not help but to turn on the whiz. Can you feel a brand new day? I had that blast in. I was singing at the top of my lungs. It was beautiful. So that's answer that question.
Yeah.
And then inspiration, you said, what sort of things inspire me? Well, one thing is nature. Nature inspires me. The beauty of nature, the poetry of nature inspires me. But also, I just think about, I don't know, other ways of helping children, again, to find themselves in literature and thinking about how I wasn't necessarily able to, but to do it in a way that, again, is uplifting, that is not stereotypical, and is really just Black kids being Black kids in America. It doesn't have to be a conversation centered on slavery or some of those other things that you typically hear, but just being kids. So some of those stories, just thinking back about my own childhood, I think inspires additional stories. And then when I get to see the faces of children who I read to or who talk about my work, that inspires me too. That makes me, it feels like this concrete evidence of what my work does, and just continues to push me to want to do more, to do better, to continue to help these babies feel seen in a positive way. So those are some things that inspire me. And also another piece too is me trying to be creative. I don't know if that makes sense. Like trying to think outside the box for different things. Poetry in itself is a challenge because you got to find the right words in every way, especially when you're doing it in rhyme and in picture books that also have to include things like narrative arcs. So that challenge also inspires me because then I'm like, okay, JaNay, what you got? Yeah, here's the idea.
Yeah.
Can you make this happen?
Yeah.
So those are some different things that inspire me.
So when you write, do you, and I know you said your daughter is 3, almost 4, do you write for her, or is there like who do you write for in specifically, and how do you come up with an idea for the story?
I think it depends on the story, but sometimes I write for her. Other times I write because there's something in my soul that I got to get out. Like I need to say this, and it comes out through my writing. One example I think is Imani's Moon, which Vivian wasn't even here yet. You know, the idea of Imani's Moon, it took 8 years to get from the idea to actually holding a book in my hand. But I had something that I needed to say. I needed to show, you know, in this case, little Black girls that regardless of all the no's that you get, regardless of all the naysayers, you have people who are rooting for you like her mother. And you can make the impossible happen. You can meet that challenge, like in this case, touching the moon. Of course, I wrote it in sort of a folktale, magical way, but the underlying message of being, you know, I think even there's some of the text that says, you know, impossible, it's only impossible until someone accomplishes it. It's just you who has to believe. So in that case, that was something that I needed to get out from my heart, telling children, you can accomplish. It's not going to be easy. You're going to have to overcome, but it's possible. But then there's other things like other books. The new one that's coming out in June, it's called Shh, the Baby's Asleep. And it's a direct inspiration from Vivian as an infant. When me and my husband were trying to keep the space quiet so she can get that nap real quick. So really, I get inspiration from different places.
So when did you name, you said you began writing when you were in elementary school, but when did you name yourself an author? Like when did you realize I'm an author?
That's a really interesting question because I think that that's still, this is gonna sound crazy, but it's still pretty recent. Um, it's still pretty recent. And I also still feel like I'm, I still feel like I'm growing into that, you know? I, um, I think Imani's Moon had come out and I was like, okay, cool, cool. And then Grandma's Tiny House, I got a contract for that. I was like, okay, cool, cool, you know? So I'm not a one-hit wonder. There's others that have come out. And then just, you know, within last year, I mean, I have like all these contracts. Minimally, I could say 9 more books coming out. The first starting in 20
Wow.
with the baby's asleep. 9 more and counting. I've got some other ones that I haven't even like shared out yet. So now I'm like, okay, I think I'm an author. I think I'm an author.
Wow.
So
That's amazing. Well, so can you tell us about Grandma's Tiny House? Did you talked a little bit about Imani's Moon and the baby's asleep. So tell us about Grandma's Tiny House.
Grandma's Tiny House is another example of a story that was directly inspired by my family. So my dad had 13, 14 siblings, you know, growing up. And so often for Thanksgiving, as during my childhood, during Thanksgiving, we would go to my grandma's house to celebrate. And her house, you know, was a regular size house, but when you put in, you know, 14 siblings who then they got kids and some of their kids got kids, and it's just this huge family overflowing, and we would all fit into her itty bitty house, and it was wonderful. Like the space didn't matter because we were in there together. We were sharing good food, stories, laughter together. And so that is what inspired Grandma's Tiny House. And then the educator in me was also like, yeah, but can we get some, you know, some math in there? Can we get some learning in there? So it's a counting book and it counts to 15, which you don't see very often in books. You see like up to 10 or maybe 20, but I wanted to do 15 because my ECE, my early childhood education brain is saying, you know, kids struggle with 11, 12, 13, 14, and then it starts to get easier, at least 13, right?
Yeah.
So, and then the poet in me was like, and it's going to come out in rhyme. So the inspiration for Grandma's Tiny House was my family, but then I just feel like all the parts of JaNay Brown-Wood came through in them as well to create this book that I'm so proud of. That is dedicated to my grandma and my family, because you know they had a hand in that book, but they have a hand in helping me develop into who I am today.
So where's your family from? Because you talk about going, you know, is it Sacramento or are you like, is it South or where from?
Fresno. So Fresno, but I know like before then from the South, and I can't tell you all the specifics. I know Arkansas, but I personally, I got to do some digging myself when it comes to like the genealogy and all that stuff. So currently, most of my family is in Fresno. Before then, I know Arkansas was a part of that, but I can't remember the other states off the top of my head where my family came from.
So then, what you did talk a little bit about reading stories and sharing your stories with children. Is there a way that someone can hear you read? Like, how do you reach these children or these families, or if someone, if we wanted to have an opportunity to hear you read your stories out loud, how could we do that?
So it's a variety of ways, although the ways feel like they've minimized right now because COVID. Before COVID, especially for something like a book launch, I would have a whole event. Barnes and Noble, I've had them at like Underground Books here in Sacramento. And so I would have a public event where I would share out and people from the community can come and hear me read and I can sign books and all of that. So that's pre-COVID and hopefully post-COVID once we get through this. But I also do things like author visits where individuals can contact me through my website and then set up visits that way. I have some of my books read, me reading them in like some YouTube clips. You can actually find that on my website. But because of copyright infringement, I can't read the entire book. So it's just like sections of the books. Both Imani's Moon and Grandma's Tiny House are on my website right now, sections of me reading those books. But what's really interesting is on YouTube, there are lots of other people reading my books. So if you ever go to YouTube and type in like Grandma's Tiny House, JaNay Brown-Wood, bunches of videos come up of people engaging in reading my book, which is always really exciting to see my work, you know, getting out there and spreading and touching lives. But yeah, if someone was interested in doing something like an author visit, they would reach out to me and then we would see what we get set up.
So who was the first child? Do you remember the first time you saw a child read your book and, you know, and what that was like for you?
I don't remember the very first time, but I do remember the specific example of watching my work impact a child. She was a young African-American girl, and we were at Underground Books, and I was having an event, and I'm sitting up at the front, and I've got my copy of Imani's Moon, and this was before Grandma's Tiny House came out, and she's sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of me, her copy of Imani's Moon. And as I read it, she followed along in her copy, turned the page as I turned the page, and was just like 100% present and in that moment with me and with my work and just being impacted by my words. And I don't know, I mean, that does something to you when a little girl can see herself in your words and feel uplifted by it. And there was another example when I was reading at Fairy Tale Town, which is in Sacramento, and this little girl looking up at me, and I think she had said something like, "She looks like me." And I don't remember if she was talking about me or the book, but either way, you know what I mean? It's these children are internalizing this. And are actually, it's evidence that in the case, if she's saying, I look like her, you can be up here too. You can do this. You can be an author. And then in the case of my characters who overcome these obstacles, same thing. You can do this. You can overcome these obstacles and achieve. So
I know you alluded to this, and you and I actually met because at Sac State, so we're colleagues, and you talked, and I did see that you recently published some findings from your research. So can you talk? I want to just give an opportunity for you to kind of also share a little bit about your research and how and what you found out about. You said you were looking into literacy practices and what happens when kids actually have books that look like them.
Yeah. So what's really, really interesting, I think, about the research that I'm doing is there's also this piece tied to bias and to anti-Blackness, right? So the research article that I just got published was looking at, because as I said, I want to see when you have diversity, how might that influence things like children's interest in reading books, children's narrative abilities, like some of these academic outcomes. So that specific study looked at Asian and Hispanic children aged 5 to 7 years old to see whether the race of a character on a picture book would influence their want to actually read that book, right? So what I used was Black and white characters on picture book covers, and they were identical. Now, this particular study also included an object. So these picture book covers were pretty much identical, except for one had a white male, one had a Black male, and one had an object that was in those other ones, but it was just the object. So for example, one of them was the rocket. So you had a black male with a rocket, a white male with a rocket, and just a rocket. And I put these books in front of these kids and said, which one of these would you want to read the most, right? And then they would indicate, and I would ask why. So this study not only looked at whether there was a difference in their preference for these book covers based on race, really, or if it was just an object, but it asked them the rationale. So I could hear from their own perspectives what was influencing their selection. And what was really interesting for these Asian and Hispanic children, that my statistics said that there wasn't any difference between object, Black male, white male. But when I started to look at the patterns that emerged from their rationales, there was some really interesting findings that emerged. I mean, for example, there were one of the patterns that I found was pertaining to race, that in some of their rationales, something related to like skin color or whether, the character was Black or white, something like that, came out of their mouths. I remember when I was collecting that data and having, this, I don't know, this child might have been 6 or 7 saying, oh, I don't want to read that one because I don't like Black people. I don't like that brown skin. And so those were some of the patterns that emerged. So while the statistics said that there wasn't any difference, when you actually looked at my totals, the Black book was preferred less. Then it was the white book. Then it was the object.
Okay.
So the objects came out as being what they picked the most as being preference. So that was that study. But I did another study, which was my actual dissertation, which I'm writing up currently, hopefully, for publication. This time I looked at Black, white, and Hispanic children, and I used just the Black and white covers to see if there was a difference in preference. And there was, and it was statistically significant. And so what that study found was that for the white and Hispanic children, that they did prefer the white book. But for the Black children, there was not a significant difference in preference. So, wow. I mean, it's really interesting. And personally, Amina, one thing that I feel like is so important about my work, and I'm just getting started, is that it's providing some evidence for not only why we need more diversity in books, but we need them to be required readings within the classroom. Because my study is saying that if, say, a young Hispanic child had a choice of a book that has a Black person on it and a book that doesn't, then they might pick that other one. They might have a higher likelihood of picking that other one. But scholars also say that books are mirrors, they're windows, and they're sliding glass doors. They can allow for a child to build some compassion as they're learning about other people's experiences. But if this child is not likely to pick up the book that has a Black character, then how are you going to build some of that compassion in learning about that other experience? So this is why in the classroom, we need that teacher to require books that have diversity in it. And now in this case, of course, my study was looking at anti-Blackness and some of those issues, but this is why we need books that have Black characters to be required. Now, I'm not saying only books that have Black characters, but we need that so that we can help these children use these books as sliding glass doors and windows, a glimpse into someone else's experiences, so you can find some of those connections, but build some compassion related to some of these differences, and to start breaking down some of these prejudices and biases that exist. So
just really quickly on your research. So what age, like how old were the students that you were studying when you did your dissertation and this more recent study?
5 to 7 years old was the range. And I picked that age because research that's looking at biases and prejudices, specifically explicit biases and implicit biases, right? Because my study really is looking at this explicit bias that they find around age 7, between 7 and 10, that there's like this decrease in explicit bias, meaning this bias that's conscious, that you have some control over. You see a decrease. However, things like implicit bias, these internal biases that you don't really have control over, it stays pretty consistent through childhood into adulthood. So the way that I take that is implicit bias stays pretty consistent, whereas explicit, I can filter what I say, because I know, generally you're not supposed to say, oh, I don't like Black people, and this is why I don't want that book. Children are, again, doing that until 7 to 10 years old. So I try to pick children who are right before that age, where some of those explicit biases might be filtered, to really, hear from them, like, why do you want this book and why don't you want this book? Mm-hmm. So I'd like to also look at preschoolers too, some of the younger children. And this is, like I said, just a start. My studies only use Black and white covers, but I want to look at other aspects of diversity too, other ethnicities, all of that, to see if that influences preferences as well.
So how do you balance your creative reign and sort of and I think also, it sounds to me also like you are embedding that your creativity into your research as well, but like the authorship that you're doing, and then, this work that you're doing with research and for the Academy, like how do you balance those two worlds?
Yeah, I don't know. That's like, to be continued. I think the main piece is that and this has been a challenge, especially since I'm new at the sort of university level of teaching and some of the other demands that come. I think the balance really is me working hard to find time to do them both. The creative, because that, again, goes back to, I need that. It's a part of my outlet. It's a part of my stress relief and ability to cope with some of the things that are happening around me, because it feels like a concrete way to try to make a difference in a better tomorrow. So I have to balance that with some of the demands that come with academia. But again, on that other side too, I think that my work is important. So I guess the way that I balance it is just making sure that I'm able to carve time for both of those pieces, as well as some of the other demands. And I don't have the best answer to the how yet, because I'm still learning it myself. But I do know that, especially with the creative piece, I need to be able to do that because it's such an important aspect of me. Yeah, so that's like I don't know, but this is kind of where I'm at this point.
Yes, I understand. All right, so 2 final questions. So one is, who are your mentors? Like, who are your creative mentors? Like, who are you reading in terms of other authors, and who would you like? And then out of that, like, you recommend for us, to read as well.
You're talking about specific to children's literature?
Yeah, or like who inspired, so like you read their work and it inspires you. It doesn't necessarily have to be children's literature, although it may be. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think I'll start with children's literature. Some really inspirational voices for me are like Jason Reynolds. He does some really amazing work, especially related to allowing for kids to find mirrors, especially like young Black children or adolescent Black children. So his work, I think, is really important. I also very much like a colleague of mine, a fellow creator of mine, Miranda Paul. The work that she does, I really appreciate her. And I appreciate her not even just for the children's books that she creates, but she also has this hand in helping up and coming authors, especially those of color, And so she has helped me in some different ways, and I really appreciate that. So she's someone who, as a mentor and also as someone to read. Um, Jackie Woodson, she is hashtag goals like times infinity. Her work is so important, and just her spirit and the additional things she's doing. So she is someone who I kind of look at and strive to be like, because she's powerful in those ways. Um, so on the research side and kind of the scholarly side, Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas is someone who, she was actually on my dissertation committee, and she's someone who I think is doing important work and having her voice be out there. So she's a mentor, but also my advisor, Dr. Emily Solari, is another mentor who I think is important, because she's helped mold me so much and continues to help me, especially navigating academia. And then some mentors within just where I am with the college, including you, Amina, and Amber Gonzalez, these individuals who I feel like have taken me under their wing to help me with navigating the space so that I can make a bigger impact. So yeah, I think what I'm saying is, when it comes to any of these things, mentorship is so important across the board in children's literature, in academia. And my hope is that eventually, as I kind of get my feet, that I'll be able to serve as a mentor in those ways too, across these, bridging these pieces for other individuals who want to make an impact within children's literature and also in scholarship, me to help serve as a mentor for them as well. And I also have to say, Dr. Kimberly Biddle is another mentor who's been incredibly influential in supporting me. I don't know if that fully answers your question.
She recently retired too, Dr. Biddle.
Yeah, she did. She did.
I think once, so I've recently been doing these anti-racism trainings, and very recently we were talking about Miguel Agarin's work, and he was saying, so he ran for the listeners, he ran the New Yorican Cafe, and he was bringing artists. He was also like a Shakespearean scholar, right, and a poet, and he was bringing this connection between the academy and what he called the streets. He was like, we have to bring the academy to the streets. Those things can't be separated. And I see that so much in your work, that you are also doing that, that you're like making these real world contacts of like these writings and like these aspirations for children to see themselves. And you're also doing that in your research too. So that's such a beautiful, obvious, obvious connection that you're making, and you're making it so clear and so evident, and it's just so wonderful. It's just absolutely such a wonderful
Thank you.
thing.
I
so appreciate your work, and I'm hoping that this also provide an opportunity for more people to learn about your work, to read your work, to share your work with their children. One of the things that I do for Black History Month is I started this like a couple years ago, where I send books to all the kids in my family, like my nieces, nephews, cousins, right? I send them children's books by and about Black people. And, I want them to like remember me as like the auntie that brought them the books, so now I'm like, okay, now I know where to get your work, and family, be ready, because you're going to get some of JaNay Brown this year. But the last question I have to you is about that. So like, what is keeping you, what's motivating you in this moment? Like, what's keeping you inspired and helping you to move forward? I know we've just gone through so much, as a society, as a people, and I know your work is addressing anti-Blackness, and, and helping people to be seen. But how do you help yourself to feel seen and kind of feel motivated and continue to do what you're doing?
Yeah, that's such an important question. A better tomorrow, and I know that sounds so cliche, but a better tomorrow for everyone. So, in other words, a tomorrow that doesn't include someone who looks like you or me, a Black man seeing the police and being afraid for his life, right? So, a better tomorrow through compassion and all of us seeing each other, the beauty in each other, to decrease these prejudices, these biases, to be able to validate each other, because it's all of us. All of us are important to move the country, the world forward. I want to help bring down those walls starting early. I think that's why I do this work. It starts early, because once those biases and those prejudices come up and they're internalizing, it makes it so much more difficult to overcome them. Possible, but more difficult. So starting early in our children so that they see the beauty in everyone, accept that, internalize that, so that we can move forward as a human race, right? I mean, I appreciate, I heard Jane Elliott speaking, and she's like, there is no different races. We are all the same race. That is so true. But, the way that we're so just separated right now is what causes more and more of this strife between groups. So bringing down those walls so that we can all see the beauty in each other and move forward to then overcome these actual issues that we're experiencing, like the climate change and the things like pandemics and killing people, especially marginalized groups, at a disproportionate rate, like all of those other pieces, I just feel like coming together as a group, working together, loving each other is what's going to help us overcome all of that. Yeah. And just to reiterate that it starts young and it starts early, and it's so important to help build a more beautiful, compassionate tomorrow. Yeah.
Beginning with like the empathy, right? So I'm hoping everyone, please pick up JaNay, Dr. Brown-Wood's work, her piece, also, her book, and I'll share the link to her website in the information about this particular podcast episode. This episode is going to be launching again. It's going to happen in February to celebrate Black History Month, and everybody out there, you're going to get some books. In my family, I can't afford everybody, but all my family, all the kids. And so also just wanted to say thank you so very, very much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the work that you do. It's just such important work and so valuable and so needed in this time, to help our kids build empathy and compassion for each other, and helping us to build that better world and see that better tomorrow. So thank you, JaNay.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for doing the work you're doing. Thank you for continuing to support me. I appreciate you. I see you. And I mean, it's this collective effort that moves toward that better tomorrow.
Yay!
There's no mention of my birthday. There's no mention of